I grew up in a house where love was conditional. My mother, Clara, never raised her voice in the way you'd expect from an angry parent. Instead, her weapon of choice was silence, disappointment, and the kind of cold stare that made me feel like I had failed simply for existing. From the outside, our life didn't seem so bad. We had a modest house, food on the table, and neighbors who assumed Clara was a devoted single mother doing her best. What they didn't see was the way she measured my worth against her own unfulfilled dreams. When I brought home a good grade, her first response wasn't pride, but, "Why not higher? You should have been the best." If I wore a new dress, she'd purse her lips and say, "That would look nicer if you lost 5 pounds." Compliments were rare, and when they came, they felt more like currency than affection. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to navigate her moods like a stormy sea. If she was in a rare good mood, I tiptoed carefully, hoping not to break the illusion. If she was distant or cold, I retreated into myself, journaling or escaping into books. Still, there were moments when I hoped for more. I wanted to believe that deep down, under her sharp edges, my mother loved me in a way that mattered. I wanted to think that one day she would see me not as a reflection of her failures, but as her daughter, someone worthy of unconditional love. But that day never came. Instead, small cracks in our relationship grew wider as the years passed. By the time I was 17, I had a sense that something was coming. Clara had grown restless, talking often about how she deserved more from life. I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but I would soon. Because into that fragile world of ours walked a man named Victor Hale, a man whose wealth and charm would shift the balance of our lives forever. The first time I heard my mother say his name, it was with a softness I had rarely heard in her voice. "Victor invited me to dinner tonight," she said casually, though I could see the spark in her eyes. Victor Hale was everything my mother thought she deserved, but had never managed to obtain. He was a wealthy businessman in his early 50s, tall, with perfectly combed silver hair and the kind of confidence that filled a room. He owned several properties in the city, drove luxury cars, and always seemed to have an answer for everything. Clara met him at a charity event she attended with a friend. She wasn't the type to mingle with high society, but once Victor showed interest, she transformed. Suddenly, my mother, who once complained about spending money on new clothes for me, began buying elegant dresses and expensive perfume. The woman who told me appearances don't matter was spending hours in front of the mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. She deserved companionship, I told myself. Maybe this man would bring out a softer side of her. Maybe for once she'd be happy and let me breathe. But the more time she spent with him, the more invisible I became. Victor started visiting the house. He always greeted me politely, but there was something about the way he looked through me, as if I were just background noise in the grand play of his life. He asked no questions about my studies, my dreams, or even how my day was. His focus was entirely on Clara, and she basked in it like sunlight she'd been starved of. I remember one evening vividly. I had just been accepted into a local art competition and was eager to share the news. But when I entered the living room, I found them laughing together, Clara's hand resting lightly on Victor's arm. I tried to speak, but my mother silenced me with a glance, the kind of look that said, "Not now. Don't ruin this for me." So I swallowed my words and went upstairs, my acceptance letter still clutched in my hand. From then on, it became clear. I was no longer the center of her world, if I had ever been at all. Victor filled the void she claimed had been empty for years. And though I didn't fully grasp it at the time, his presence marked the beginning of the end of whatever bond my mother and I still had left. By the time I turned 18, the tension in our house was almost unbearable. Clara's obsession with Victor had grown into a kind of mania. Every conversation, every plan revolved around him. Vacations she'd dreamed of taking with me were canceled or postponed. Instead, the focus was on dinners, galas, and meetings that I wasn't invited to. One evening, after a particularly tense week, Clara called me into the living room. Victor was there, dressed impeccably, leaning casually against the sofa. The warmth in her tone was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, almost calculating edge. "Emily," she began, her eyes fixed on some point beyond me, "it's time we talked about your future." I nodded cautiously. I had learned over the years that questions could be dangerous. A simple why might unleash a storm I wasn't prepared for. "I love you, of course," she continued, and I waited, holding my breath. "But you're grown now. You have to start living on your own. I need to focus on my life. My life with Victor." My stomach dropped. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. "What? What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "I'm saying it's time for you to leave. You're 18. You can fend for yourself. I've done everything I could for you, but now I need to move on. And Victor is part of that. I won't have anyone holding me back." I felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath me. All those years of subtle neglect, of moments where I tried to win her love, suddenly crystallized into one harsh truth. I wasn't her priority. I had never been. I can't just leave, I stammered, trying to hold back tears. I have nowhere to go. Clara's face softened for the briefest second, but it was a mask, a practiced expression that made her seem almost gentle. You'll find a way, Emily. You have to. Life isn't going to wait for you to be ready. Victor didn't say a word. He simply watched, a quiet witness to her declaration. The silence in that room was deafening. I realized then that I had been abandoned not by chance, but by choice. That night, I packed the few belongings I could carry, my hands trembling. As I stepped out of the front door, I glanced back once. Clara and Victor were there, smiling politely, waving goodbye as if I were just another inconvenience leaving the house. And in that moment, I understood. My childhood home, the one place I thought was mine, had been taken from me. The first night on my own was nothing like I had imagined it would be. I didn't have a fancy apartment or a cushy college dorm. I had the backseat of my old car and a blanket I'd grabbed on my way out. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I remember gripping my backpack tightly, feeling the weight of every memory, every disappointment, every subtle insult my mother had ever thrown at me. It was as if those years of quiet torment had been condensed into one unbearable moment, a single act of abandonment that left me reeling. The first few weeks were a blur. I slept in different friends' living rooms, couches, and occasionally, when I was desperate, in the stairwells of the local library. I found work wherever I could, waitressing, retail, delivering packages late into the night. Every shift was exhausting, but every paycheck was a small victory, proof that I could survive without her. But survival didn't erase the ache. Every time I passed a familiar street corner or heard a song we used to listen to together, I felt the sting of betrayal. Clara's face haunted me, her calm, cold eyes, the gentle smile that had fooled me for so long, and Victor Hale's silent, observing presence. They had chosen each other, and I had been left behind like an afterthought. Yet, despite the pain, I began to discover a strange, fragile kind of freedom. No one was watching me, no one was judging me, and no one was dictating what I should wear, how I should think, or what dreams I was allowed to have. I had the liberty to make mistakes and to rise again. One evening, after a particularly long day of double shifts, I sat on the steps of my temporary home and let the tears fall. For the first time, I allowed myself to mourn, not just the loss of a roof over my head, but the loss of a mother who would never truly be there for me. It was painful, yes, but it was also the beginning of my awakening. That night, I made a silent promise. I would not let this define me. I would not let her choices dictate the course of my life. I would rise, not for her, not for Victor, but for myself. The days that followed were hard, filled with uncertainty and exhaustion, but with every small triumph, a steady paycheck, a kind smile from a stranger, a warm meal I had earned myself, I began to feel a spark of resilience. I was alone, yes, but I was alive. And for the first time, the world seemed vast, full of possibilities I had never dared to imagine while living under her shadow. Life on my own was harsher than I had ever imagined. I quickly realized that independence came at a price: long hours, empty stomachs, and nights spent worrying about where I would sleep next. Every day was a test of endurance, every decision a matter of survival. I took any job I could find. One week I was a waitress at a dimly lit diner, the next I was stocking shelves at a convenience store, and sometimes I delivered packages on my bike until my muscles screamed in protest. I learned the meaning of exhaustion in ways that I had never before experienced. My body ached, my hands were rough and calloused, and my eyes often burned from lack of sleep. Yet somehow, I survived. It wasn't just the physical struggle that weighed on me. The emotional toll was far greater. I missed home, the familiar chaos, even the subtle cruelty, because at least there I had known what to expect. Now, every day was uncertainty. I missed my mother's voice, though it had once been a source of tension, and the knowledge that someone cared enough to notice when I came home late. Making friends wasn't easy either. I was older than some of my coworkers, younger than others, and my awkwardness made me hesitant to form connections. But slowly, I found a few allies, people who didn't know my story but offered smiles, small kindnesses, and a sense that I wasn't completely invisible. They became my makeshift family, helping me navigate the complexities of adult life. Financially, I learned to stretch every dollar. I became adept at budgeting, stretching meals, and finding secondhand treasures that made life just a little more comfortable. I became resourceful in ways I never would have imagined, turning a tiny apartment into a livable space, cooking simple meals that tasted like home, and finding joy in small victories. Through it all, I kept a journal, scribbling down every thought, every frustration, every fleeting moment of hope. Writing became my refuge, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions and the weight of betrayal. It reminded me that even in my darkest moments, I was still capable of reflection, growth, and resilience. Though the nights were often lonely and the days exhausting, a quiet determination began to grow within me. I refused to let Clara's choices define me. I was no longer a child dependent on her approval. I was becoming a woman who could stand on her own, even if the world seemed cold and indifferent. And in that struggle, I discovered a truth that would carry me forward. Survival was not enough. I wanted more. Independence, purpose, and a life that was entirely mine. Months passed, and the endless grind began to carve something new within me. The girl who had once trembled at my mother's words was slowly transforming into someone unrecognizable, even to myself. I discovered a strength I hadn't known existed, a resilience that thrived on every obstacle I overcame. It started with small victories. I paid my own bills without borrowing a cent. I cooked meals that weren't just edible, but satisfying. I organized my life with a discipline that Clara had never demanded of me, but now I imposed on myself, not out of fear, but out of a desire to succeed. Each task completed, each challenge faced, was a reminder that I was capable of living independently. Then came the emotional growth. I learned to recognize the manipulation and subtle cruelty that had defined my childhood. I no longer internalized every criticism or carried the weight of my mother's disappointment. I began setting boundaries, even if it meant feeling guilty at first. With each boundary I enforced, I felt lighter, freer, more like my own person. Education became a sanctuary. I enrolled in night classes, sometimes falling asleep over textbooks after 12-hour shifts. Yet, every hour of study, every skill I acquired, strengthened not just my mind, but my sense of self. I realized that knowledge was power, and power was what Clara had denied me by trying to control my life. I also learned the importance of connection. I sought friendships that were genuine, people who supported me without judgment or manipulation. Slowly, I built a small circle of people who became my anchor, my chosen family. They reminded me that love could exist without strings, that support didn't always come with conditions. One particularly rainy night, as I walked home from work, drenched and exhausted, I paused under a street lamp and reflected on how far I'd come. I remembered the first night I had slept in my car, shivering and terrified. And now, standing there, I felt a surge of pride. I had survived, yes, but more importantly, I had grown. Victor Hale and my mother were no longer the center of my universe. Their choices no longer dictated my emotions or my future. I had discovered that strength was not about never falling, it was about rising every time life pushed you down. And in that realization, I began to truly feel free. For the first time, I didn't just survive, I thrived. By the time I was 20, the person I had become was almost unrecognizable from the scared, uncertain girl who had been thrown out of her home. I had managed to carve a life for myself that was independent, fulfilling, and entirely my own. Every small victory along the way, from securing a stable job to finding a tiny apartment I could call home, felt monumental, as if each step was a declaration of my existence. I focused on my career, starting as an assistant in a small design firm. It wasn't glamorous and the hours were long, but it allowed me to channel my creativity and intelligence into something tangible. I began taking night classes to improve my skills, studying late into the evenings while sipping cheap coffee, and ignoring the fatigue in my body. The work was exhausting, yes, but it gave me a sense of purpose and pride that I had never experienced under my mother's shadow. Friendship became a cornerstone of my new life. I surrounded myself with people who celebrated my successes, comforted me during failures, and treated me as an equal. I laughed more than I had in years, discovering humor and joy in simple moments. A cup of tea with a friend, a walk through the park at sunset, a quiet evening with a book. Slowly, I began to understand that life could be beautiful, even in the absence of the family I had lost. Financial independence brought a confidence I had never known. Paying my own bills, furnishing my small apartment, and saving a little for the future were victories that reminded me daily that I could survive and thrive without relying on anyone who had once sought to control me. Each coin in my savings felt like a tiny declaration. I am capable. I am worthy. I am free. I also allowed myself to dream again. Where once my ambitions had been stifled by fear of judgment or ridicule, I now imagined a future where my choices belonged solely to me. I envisioned traveling to distant cities, creating art that mattered, and building relationships rooted in trust and mutual respect. And yet, no matter how far I had come, a quiet shadow of the past lingered. I couldn't forget Clara or the life she had chosen over me. I couldn't entirely ignore Victor Hale, whose presence had marked the moment my childhood ended. But I realized that their choices, though painful, had forged the foundation for my strength. In building my life, I discovered not just survival, but resilience. I had transformed my pain into power, my abandonment into independence. The life I had built was imperfect, yes, but it was mine. And for the first time, I felt that sense of quiet victory that comes from knowing you've taken control of your own destiny. It had been 6 years since I left home, and in that time, I had become someone my younger self would barely recognize, strong, independent, and unafraid of standing alone. I had a steady job, a small circle of friends who had become like family, and a life that I had carefully built from scratch. Then one day, out of nowhere, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something in the tone of the message made my heart tighten. It was Clara. "Emily," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, almost fragile. I need to see you. Please." It's important." I stared at the phone, frozen. For a moment, the old feelings, the hurt, the betrayal, the loneliness, threatened to resurface. But I also felt something else, a calm, steady awareness that I had my own life now. My choices would no longer be dictated by her whims. When I finally agreed to meet, it was in a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Clara arrived first, impeccably dressed, as if nothing had changed. Victor Hale was with her, though he lingered at a distance, his presence polite but distant. She waved, a tight, rehearsed smile on her face. "Emily," she began, once I had sat down, "I know I hurt you. I was selfish. I made choices that I thought were best, but I see now. I see that I abandoned you." I listened, nodding slowly. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind countless times, imagining confrontation, anger, tears. But when faced with her apology, I felt only a strange detachment. The girl who once needed her mother's approval was gone. "Clara," I said softly, "I survived without you. I built a life without you. And I'm proud of that. I'm not here to punish you, but I can't pretend that what you did doesn't matter." She looked down, guilt flashing across her face. Victor shifted uncomfortably beside her. There was a silence that stretched, heavy, and almost unbearable. But I didn't flinch. I realized in that moment that the power had shifted. I was no longer the child she could control. I was my own person. Though I felt a pang of sadness for what we could have had, I also felt a strange relief. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful hugs. Instead, there was an acknowledgement, quiet, honest, and final. She had returned, yes, but I no longer needed her to define me. And in that truth, I found peace. The confrontation wasn't explosive, as I had imagined it countless times. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic accusations hurled across a crowded room. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, and filled with an intensity that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. Clara had asked to meet again. This time at my small apartment, a place that bore my fingerprints, my choices, my life. When she arrived, I led her in and offered her a seat, noticing the way her eyes scanned the room, taking in everything I had built without her. There was curiosity there, but also a hint of unease. "I wanted to see how you're doing," she began cautiously. I can't stop thinking about what I did." I studied her for a moment, taking in the familiar features twisted now with age and regret. "You don't get to control my feelings, Clara," I said steadily. "You didn't when I was 18, and you don't now. I've spent years healing from what you did. I'm not that scared little girl anymore." Victor Hale, who had come along, lingered in the doorway. His presence reminded me of the life my mother had chosen over me, the path that had forced me into independence. I took a deep breath. "You had your chance," I said, looking Clara directly in the eyes. "You made your choice. And I made mine. I survived without you, and I thrived." For a moment, there was silence, thick and tense. Claire's lips trembled, and I saw the flash of shame cross her face. She wanted a response, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps validation that her actions hadn't destroyed everything. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "I don't hate you," I added, my voice soft but firm. "But I don't need you to be part of my life. I am not the person you left behind. I am Emily. And this is my world." It was in that moment, as she nodded slowly, that I understood the final truth. Confrontation wasn't about making her understand or regret her choices. It was about me claiming my own narrative. For years, I had been reacting to her decisions, shaping myself around her whims. Now, I was writing my own story. Victor stepped forward slightly, perhaps sensing the shift in power, and Clara's hand instinctively moved to his arm. I realized that for them, life continued as usual. But for me, life had changed forever. I had grown, I had claimed my strength, and nothing could take that from me. That confrontation, quiet as it was, marked a boundary I would never allow to be crossed again. I had faced my past, stared into the eyes of those who abandoned me, and emerged whole. After that confrontation, I felt a strange weight lift from my shoulders. For years, I had carried the burden of abandonment, the shadow of my mother's choices, and the echo of Victor Hale's presence in our lives. But now, standing firmly in my own apartment, surrounded by the life I had built, I felt something I hadn't known for a long time: peace. Choosing myself didn't happen in a single moment. It was the culmination of years spent surviving, struggling, and slowly learning that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. It was in the long nights of studying while exhausted, the days spent working multiple jobs, the small victories of independence, paying my own rent, decorating my space, nurturing friendships that were genuine. Each step, each choice, reinforced a truth I could never ignore. I belonged to myself. I began to envision a future shaped entirely by my desires. I dreamed of traveling, exploring cities I had once only read about, and meeting people who inspired and challenged me. I pursued art not for validation, but because it fulfilled me. I embraced love cautiously, but openly, building connections founded on trust and respect, not obligation or manipulation. And as I built my life, I realized that my past didn't define me. Claire's choices, Victor's presence, and the pain of abandonment had shaped me. Yes, but they hadn't broken me. They had forced me to confront my fears, to find my voice, and to embrace my resilience. I also learned forgiveness, not for their sake, but for mine. I forgave my mother for abandoning me, not because her actions were acceptable, but because carrying anger and bitterness had held me captive longer than her absence ever could. Forgiveness allowed me to move forward without being tethered to the pain of the past. Most importantly, I embraced my own power. I chose myself every day, in my decisions, my priorities, and the boundaries I set. I no longer needed to seek validation from those who failed me. I had become my own source of strength. Looking back, I understood the painful truth. Some people never change, some choices cannot be undone, and some relationships are meant to end. But in that ending, I found a beginning that was mine alone. I had survived, I had grown, and I had thrived. And for the first time, I was truly free. I really appreciate you watching all the way through. Your support means the world. Like, subscribe, and take a look at my previous videos to keep the stories going. Bye!